We have been talking about colonialism, imperialism, European expansion, a lot of different ways you could term this, but primarily we're talking about the late 18th century, beginning in the 18th century and continuing into the 19th century. Now at first, expansion and colonialism, if we go back, say, to the Portuguese and the Spanish, a lot of it was focused upon spices. So some people have called it Christians and spice. By the word Christian, they mean evangelism. Evangelism, spreading the gospel, building churches, sending missionaries, that sort of thing. As well as searching for spices, all the various spices that make everything taste so good. This is what Europeans wanted. So prior to 1800, that is mostly what was there, and there wasn't a lot of an attempt to control the territories. It was more you needed some harbors, you needed some agreements for trade, and that would suffice. But as they are looking for spices, of course, they began to find other things that could be profitable besides spices. Other raw materials, and we mentioned this before, raw materials to make goods and a market for the finished goods, a marketplace for the finished goods of Europe. And of course, we've used England as our example, right? They needed cotton that wouldn't grow in England, and they'd have finished goods, which would be all kinds of textiles, clothes, and so forth. So we're going to see that the Industrial Revolution is going to bring a lot of change. The Industrial Revolution, which we've already talked about, begins in England and begins to spread onto the continent of Europe, and of course across to America, North America, the United States, and so forth. And this will bring a lot of changes. The whole world begins to change. We are seeing the development of what we might call a modern world. Not based upon agriculture anymore for your economy, but could be based upon finished goods, materials, and things like that. That's really going to begin to change things quite a bit. And so we have economic expansion, imperialism, all caused by these economic changes. But of course, there's not only economic reasons that might drive someone or a group of people to want to control another area. Certainly, if we said it was only economic, I think that would be, well, inaccurate. It certainly is more than that, right? It also has to do with political reasons. Like I said before, I think, didn't I mention the game of Risk, right? You get one area to sort of block somebody from another area. There's that kind of stuff going on, or to gain access to another area. There's also nationalistic reasons. You think you're the best. And since you are the best, well, shouldn't other people get to experience just a little bit of what it's like to be you, right? You could share your goodness, share your whatever with others. So that's part of it too. Another idea too is to keep your country strong. Keep your country strong. Because the idea that we talked a little bit about social Darwinism, that if your country is not growing, it was sort of the idea that if your country is not growing, then it is declining. That if you're not developing in a positive way, that you are rescending in a negative way. This idea that you just sort of stay stable, that wasn't really very well accepted, right? So grow or begin to die. That was the idea. And so what are we going to do? We need more territory. We got to grow. How will we make our territory bigger, our economic base bigger? How are we going to do that? We have to expand and extend our power. Well, over here in the corner now, you can see a little political cartoon that I put up here. It's going to be hard to read it, I suppose, especially from the back. But that's England. This guy with the hat on is supposed to be England, and he is on the island, because England is just a small island. But then take a look at these tentacles. Becomes more than an octopus, because there's more than 8 legs. But like an octopus, these legs going all around the world. Hard to read. But in the upper left here, it says Australia, Borsland, let's see, Egypt down here, and the canal, which I assume means the Suez Canal. Canada over here, Jamaica. Well, you start to get the idea. There's, of course, India. All of these places are places which England controls, all over the world. So this little cartoon or this little drawing is trying to show that England, while it comes from a small island, like an octopus, it has its long legs that reach really all over the world, from Asia to the Middle East to Africa, North to South America, and so forth. Okay, so this is part of it. Now, a guy who typifies this idea of expansion and of control, and I suppose imperialism, would be this guy here, Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes. Notice that he has his left foot on one side, the north side of Africa, his right foot on the south side of Africa, in South Africa. His arms stretched out, showing how he is stretching his arms over the continent. Well, the British did control Egypt in the north, and they had controlled areas down here in South Africa, like what would be Zimbabwe today. By the way, does anybody know the name of Zimbabwe before it was called Zimbabwe? Like back in like 68 or anyway, somewhere around close to 1970, they changed the name of this country to Zimbabwe, but before that it was called Rhodesia. How did he get that name? From Cecil Rhodes. Rhodesia. The country was named for him. And basically there's a rift valley that runs from along this side of the continent of Africa. And it was the goal of Cecil Rhodes for England to control all the land along the Rift Valley. They almost made it, pretty close, that they controlled all of that land. By the way, have you ever heard of Rhodes Scholars? That's the name for this guy. He gave a bunch of money to Oxford University to bring people from out in the, outside of England to Oxford to train them to be more British, basically, to learn the British way. That's called a Rhodes Scholar, and those are, you can apply for those. You could apply. You could become a Rhodes Scholar. Well, anyway. He says, my ruling purpose is to extend the British Empire. And there was a competition for some of these colonies. Certainly up until the end of the 19th century, Europe was primarily those who are becoming colonialists, right? And the U.S., the United States doesn't really get involved in as much in the 19th century at all, in the 1800s. Why? So we had an entire continent that we were settling, right? From the Atlantic to the Pacific and all that territory in between. We also added Alaska, So we had a lot of territory to tame, some might say, conquer, inhabit, civilize, we might say, right? So, in other words, the United States, if you want to think of it as a colonial power, it's really a colonial power what becomes the United States, starting on the East Coast and then moving to the West Coast and filling everything in. So we don't really kind of start on any of this too much until you get to the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Also, this is when Japan gets involved. Japan imitates the European powers and begins to become an imperial power itself and building colonies, if you will, across Southeast Asia, the Japanese Empire. But back in Africa, by 1900, both Africa and Asia were almost completely controlled by European power, colonial powers. So that's one big factor to think of in the 19th century. This tremendous expansion of the European nations into colonial areas and obtaining colonies. The other thing that is a big factor, what drives things, is that we see the Ottoman Empire, which was a huge empire, went across North Africa, we went across the Middle East, went all the way up to Eastern Europe. It was collapsing. It was called the sick old man of Europe, and eventually it will collapse by the time you get to World War I. It's like sound effects. And also China. China is collapsing. China is in big trouble in the 19th century as well, in large measure because of the European expansion into China. And we'll talk about that more later, right? Well, in Asia, for example, the Philippines, a group of islands that you've probably heard about, came under the control of Spain. They controlled the Philippines. It's part of their expansion into Asia. The Dutch have moved into the East Indies, what we would probably call Indonesia and today. The East India Company, which remember is a British company, which controlled, well, eventually, basically all of India, will expand out into Malaysia by 1786 and into Singapore by 1819. And Burma, the British go into Burma in 1826. So you can see the British are just really expanding out from India and further east. Burma, Singapore, Malaysia. So you see the expansion that's taking place. Now, another country that's really expanding into Asia, especially Southeast Asia, is France. You may not think of the French much as colonial powers. I don't know if you do or not, but if you don't think they were colonial powers, well, you need to correct that thinking because they were, especially in Southeast Asia. The French come to control Vietnam. Here is a territory you've probably heard of, Vietnam. How did the United States get involved in Vietnam? The French. If you want to point the fingers at somebody, I mean, the French were pulling out of Vietnam, and they talked us into helping them get out of there. And once they got out, then we were in, and, well, that's a whole other story for another day. But it was called at that time French Indochina. Well, the French got into this part of Southeast Asia when some of their missionaries got into trouble. You remember I told you that what I sometimes call the 3 M's of this sort of colonial period. Merchants, people coming to make money and trade and so forth. Which once people are aware that you can get there and what's there, then the missionaries show up. Which, of course, for the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese are all Roman Catholic. For the British, they'll be Anglicans, they'll be Protestants. But often when the missionaries get there and some other, and you have the merchants there, some conflict will happen, some problem will happen, and then the military will come in to protect the citizens, the missionaries, the merchants, or whoever. And so that's the other M. Remember? Merchants, missionaries, and then the military. So that's a pattern. I'm not saying it's followed exactly in every place, but it's a pretty good outline of what happens in a lot of these places. So here, the missionaries are persecuted in 1859. The French troops come in, and they take control of Asia, what would be Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They expanded all these areas between 1859 and 1893. This then creates the French, what comes to be called the French Indochina. Look at that. We got Vietnam sliding right onto the screen. That's nice, isn't it? Well, here's Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, there's China, down here's Cambodia. So some of them, obviously Vietnam is highlighted here, but notice these countries are long, mostly long and narrow, because there are mountains there and ridges. So there's mountains and valleys. It's easier to communicate up and down a valley than it is to go across mountains. And so that's really what it, if you want a simplified version, that's why this area is sort of long, narrow countries. But you see Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Now, in between here is a country called Thailand. I think it's good for you to know where Thailand is located, because Thailand is going to be able to avoid being taken over by a colonial power. They're surrounded by others who are. How do they do that? Well, pretty shrewd. They basically sold themselves as a kind of buffer between the French and then over here, the British. Thailand says, well, let us be your buffer, and we'll be kind of the mediator for you. We'll say, and Thailand is never incorporated into either the British or the French powers. They remain independent. They have their own king. And pretty shrewd. All right, so there's Southeast Asia. Asia continued. Here you go. Here's a floating market. They have these long, narrow boats. They put their vegetables and whatever on there. And you kind of paddle in between, pick up what you need. I'll take some papaya. I'll take some whatever, right? I'll take some monkeys. Hey, you know what I've heard? Florida's got more monkeys now, so I'm getting excited.
You told us this last.
We got a monkey problem, but I hear they're coming to Lakeland. When they get this new railway built, they want to build a railway to Lakeland. Did you hear about that? From Miami all the way to Tampa or something. It's going to go through Lakeland. Well, we'll see if it happens. When that happens, it'll be easy for the monkeys just to hitch onto the train. They'll be going all over Florida for free. Well, anyway, the Dutch, Indonesia, early 1600s. And as I said, Thailand is an independent buffer between the French and the British territories. This is formally agreed to in 1896 when the French and the British signed an agreement that basically says Thailand's going to be sort of neutral, buffer zone, or whatever you want to call it, sort of like the Switzerland of Southeast Asia, I guess, if there can be a Switzerland. And Thailand has been able to avoid a lot of the turmoil. Even like during the Vietnam War and stuff, Thailand was a relatively safe place to be if you're in that part of the world. Well, anyway, there we go. I just want to talk about that Thailand and its independence for a moment. Again, looking for names for your children. Here's a good one for you. Chulalongkorn. Chulalongkorn. That would be, it'd be the only kid in his school with that name. Well, we'll see, but I would venture that would be a pretty good bet. Won't have, although you're going to have a hard time finding one of those little license plates to put on your door. You know, the little license plates with your name. They still make those. They used to make little license plates about like this, and they have like your name on it, and people put it on the door to their bedroom or something. You know. Hard to find Chulalongkorn on one of those. It'd be kind of frustrated. Anyway, Thailand and independence. And then here's another good name, Mongkut. Mongkut is the king, and then this is his son, Chulalongkorn. Well, the Thai rulers. Now, you might have heard about this. There was a movie. There's been more than one movie about The King and I. You ever heard of this? The King and I? There was also a Broadway play, a musical, or fairly recently, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, called The King and I. And then there was a movie way back in the 60s. It was called The King and I. And then another one, I think, in the 80s, the early 90s. Well, anyway, the story has been often told because there was a woman, a British woman. Her name is Anna. She comes to be a tutor in the household of Mongkut, the king. And she writes, she keeps sort of journals, and she eventually writes a book, roughly called The King and I, and how she worked in the household of the king of Siam, it was called then, but Thailand, and how she trained even this guy, the guy who became the next king, in things British, English language, literature, poetry, history, because Mongkut wanted his children, especially the ones who would be the next rulers, to know English and French, and to know the history of England and the history of France. Why? So that they could be this good go-between, which would assure them to remain independent and keep them out of a lot of the problems that were potentially could happen in their part of the world. So she was hired to be that English tutor, I guess I'd call it. So there was another movie called Anna and the King. Maybe 25 years ago. And then earlier in one called The King and I. Based upon these journals. Well, Thailand remains independent by this relationship with France and England, and through their commitment, especially the king's commitment to learn Western ideas. Now, how many people here went to McKinley High School? Yeah, we don't get many McKinley High School. McKinley Middle School? McKinley Elementary School? McKinley Preschool? No. Well, he's president of the United States, McKinley, right around the turn of the century, 1890s. And one of the things that happens during his period is that it's coming right on the heels of the Spanish-American War. We have a war with Spain. I don't know if you've learned about it or not, but we did have a war with Spain. And as a result, part of that was because of the conflict, especially over Cuba and what the Spanish were doing in Cuba. That also kind of got us involved with the Philippines because the Spanish controlled the Philippines. So this is what's going to give the sort of toehold, the area where the United States will sort of get involved in this realm of Asia. It'll be through the Philippines. Philippines and Guam, some other islands out there. But we get these islands, we take them as protectorates, I believe is the official name, during the Spanish-American War. We defeated the Spanish in Manila Bay. Manila, of course, the main city of the Philippines, the main harbor of the Philippines. Different people have different interpretations, but as I read it, McKinley was a bit reluctant to try to incorporate the Philippines somehow under U.S. control because it's so far away. I mean, it's halfway around the world. But I think the factor that really encouraged him to go ahead and make a commitment to the Philippines being a protectorate of the United States was the looming interest of the Japanese. The Japanese were building a major empire in Asia, and McKinley and others in his administration were convinced that should we just liberate the Philippines from Spain and then just sail away and leave them on their own, that in a short amount of time they would be under the control of Japan. And so the United States stays in the Philippines. We keep our interest in the Philippines for a very long time, I'd say until 1980s. Early 1990s, so probably about almost 100 years. And then many people in the Philippines wanted us out, and so we left. But of course, the Philippines have had problems since, because now they have Al-Qaeda and other Islamic groups on their southern islands, and they are beginning to take control of the southern islands of the Philippines and moving north. They're coming from Indonesia and Malaysia, which are also Islamic islands. So anyway, we have given the Philippines some more assistance, but it is becoming a more risky place than it used to be. I think that's safe to say. You might hear more about it rather than less about it in the next 20 years or so. That's just my guess. I'm not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet. We got enough to cover about what happened in the past than me trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. But anyway, it's an area to watch. Here's a lovely headline: Dewey smashes Spanish fleet. This is Commodore Dewey. He leads the American forces against the Spanish. I have some of the drawings of the ships down here. And again, this was more than 100 years ago now, 120 years ago, roughly. This is when the U.S. actually takes control, and the Spanish begin to they lost their influence. Not only here in the Philippines, but we're not really talking too much about it here, but also in Cuba. Cuba will then become a protectorate of the U.S.
Yeah, like the excuse that went to war to help the Cubans because they blew up the U.S. and Spain, the Spanish did it.
Yes.
That was their thought.
Remember the Maine. Yeah, the idea, the U.S. ship, the Maine, was blown up. And basically, it was believed that the Spanish had blown it up. And so this is what eventually led into the war between the U.S. and Spain. It was really focused on Cuba, but of course then it expanded out to the Philippines. All right, so this, my point is, the United States is now getting involved in the Pacific and expanding away from our borders, because we got the Philippines. There's also out there, we obtained Guam, the Marshall Islands, the Hawaiian Islands. These are all areas out towards the Pacific, or certainly a long ways from the U.S., where we're starting to get involved in the Pacific area. Well, here is a lovely map of the Philippines. Notice their proximity up here. This is Thailand. And notice right down here is Malaysia and Indonesia. So if you wonder why are these southern islands today becoming affected or under the influence of Islam, radical Islam, it's because they're coming right from these areas here, right over here. It's not very far away, actually. In fact, you may have heard stories about people being kidnapped, especially missionaries. I remember hearing, what was it, last year? A woman who, she was a missionary in the Philippines, and her and her husband were kidnapped, and they were held for several months by the Muslim forces in the south part of the Philippines. They were working further north, but they came down to the south because I guess there was some like a resort, beach where they were spending a few days. Then they were kidnapped, they along with other people. Well, anyway, there's Manila. That's where Manila Bay is. And then, of course, China is right there. So sort of branching the areas from Thailand, China, all the way down to Malaysia. The stretch of many islands make up the Philippines. Well, let's look at Africa, if we will. I put a picture of monkeys just because I like monkeys. It really has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Other than people believed that Africa was quite remote, Europeans, and very dangerous. It was a place that, that most would be afraid to enter into it. And so they had little interest in going inland, little interest in trying to deal with various wild animals and perhaps harsh climate. And so in the beginning, Europeans' contact with Africa was primarily, they were on their way to get spices, but they knew that slaves had come from Africa because Muslim slave traders had been selling slaves to Europeans, but those slaves are coming from the east part of Africa, and now the Europeans are coming down the west coast of Africa. And I think, as I may have mentioned before, when the slave trade takes place, the Europeans show up. They don't just sort of jump off the boat, grab people, put them on the boat, and sail away. There actually is a process that happens. The people who live along the coast of Africa capture their enemies who live further inland. It's a good way to get rid of their enemies. If they can capture them, rather than kill them, they capture them, and then they trade them to the Europeans for things that they want. So the first step in the slave trade actually starts with Africans being involved. Then the Europeans put them on the ships and take them off to Europe and so forth and sell them. Later on, of course, the route will take them to these ships to the Caribbean, to Brazil and South America, and especially the Caribbean, because there these slaves are going to be used in the production of sugar. There's actually many more slaves taken from Africa to South America and the Caribbean than ever came to North America, primarily because of sugar.
Brazil was like the last, I think it was like 1888 was the last time.
To get rid of slavery, abolish slavery. Yeah, they were one of the last countries to abolish slavery. Brazil had a lot of slaves. And places like, Barbados and Jamaica and so forth. All these areas had a lot of slavery and a lot of plantations, but almost all of it was sugar. Because I don't know if you've seen sugar fields. We have them here in Florida. Sugar will grow here. But it grows in a thicket. It grows like, almost looks like bamboo or something, like really tall plants that are growing. It'll grow 20 feet high, let's say. What's that?
Sugarcane.
Sugarcane. Yeah, what did I say?
You just like...
It grows like bamboo, but it's sugar cane. But anyway, what I'm saying is it grows really tall. It'll grow fairly quickly, but they just let it grow thick. There's not like it's rows or something. You think there might be rows of it and you go in. No, they just plant it in a field and it just takes over the field. So then when you get ready to cut it, you got to cut the whole field. And it's very hard work. Of course, it's very hot and humid climate. And you have to go in and they just clear cut it out, and then they haul all that stuff in. It's real long, so they have to cut it into at least a few pieces. Then they throw it in a big vat of water. They have boiling water, and they throw in the sugar cane. The sugar cane then the boiling water sort of renders out the sugar from the cane. Then you have to take that cane, that green stuff out, and you got this syrup-like stuff that's in there. And then they keep boiling it down until they make what? Anybody know? Molasses, yeah. So you can take, like a big chunk of sugarcane field, boil it down to make, some barrels of molasses. It's a lot easier to haul barrels of molasses than giant boatloads of sugarcane. Let somebody else try to deal with it. And then they would take the sugarcane, and what would they make out of that? I mean, the molasses, what would they make out of that? Very popular. Rum. So the molasses then is distilled, fermented, distilled, and then you take, a barrel of molasses and you make some bottles of rum. So each process, reduces the size of what you're making, but increase the cost of what you're having. And so a lot of that sugar cane was grown in the Caribbean area, South America. It was cut and turned into molasses. A lot of that molasses was actually delivered to New England and made into rum, and then the rum was shipped off to Europe. Well, I'm sure not all of it. And then, sort of formed a triangle of trade, or whatever you want to call it. There were some ports of trade. Well, anyway, that's why there was such a market for African slaves. It was primarily for cheap labor in fields, primarily sugarcane, but also cotton fields, and to a lesser extent, tobacco. Tobacco is also a labor-intensive crop. I don't know if you've seen tobacco fields, but I lived in Kentucky for a long time. They grew a lot of tobacco at one time, and you have to go out and plant it by hand. You have to cut it by hand. You have to let it dry. Then you have to go and tear out the veins of the leaves and bundle it. And that's none of that's mechanized even today. So there's a lot of manual labor that goes into tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane. Well, here's a look at that trade. The top left is a sort of drawing of a kind of, I don't know what to call it, a guide or anyway, but of how slaves would be packed into these ships in the lower decks. And so many slaves died en route because it's so crowded. They're right next to each other. They tried to get as many slaves in there as they could. But as the slave trade declined, ironically, I think, the interest in Africa grew. That isn't going inland. By the way, this is, I think, an instructive map here in the lower left corner. It shows you the relative number of slaves that are taken from Africa by the thickness of the lines. This blue one is Brazil. And then this one, this kind of green one, is French Caribbean. The yellow one is Spanish Caribbean. And then this thinner red line is North America. So there were a lot more slaves going to the Caribbean and South America than North America, simply because of the sugar cane and plantations. Yes?
Who was organizing the slaves going to Brazil? Was that like the Brazilian government?
No, I think it was. I don't think it was so much a government thing. I think this was business. I don't know if I could point you to just one entity, but people, those who had large plantations in, some of it was coffee too, sugar, things like that. So I don't think it was the government, doing it directly. I think these were. There were slave traders, guys who just would show up in port with slaves and sell them. But of course, if nobody wants to buy them, then they wouldn't come there. So there was a big market there. So yeah, there were dedicated ships that were just slave ships, And what they did was they would just go back and forth between ports, obtaining and selling slaves. Yeah, there's a lot more that could be covered there. But what starts to happen, the Dutch got involved with slave trade pretty early, but they outlaw their use of slave trade. The country, the Dutch people outlaw it in 1795. So that makes it illegal for any ship bearing the flag of the Dutch to carry slaves. That's really what it means. If they do it, it's illegal. In 1803, those from Denmark, the Danes, 1803, England, 1808, the U.S., not until 1863, right? And by 1815, only Portugal and Spain are dealing in slaves from Europe. I mean, European countries that'll still be involved in slave trade. So that means that for most of the 19th century, the slave trade is in great decline. And by that I mean, hauling people from Africa somewhere else as slaves. Now, a whole nother part of this that we're not talking about is that once the slaves arrived in Brazil or the Caribbean or North America, they had children. Those children also were enslaved. So, in part, the slave market, as far as slave trade on ships, wasn't as necessary. In other words, the market for that wasn't as high, because you sort of had a domestic slave trade that could be carried out without using ships. Well, anyway, much more that could be said here. Now, this, I think, is an excellent diagram that starts to give you numbers. This was done by a guy named Philip Curtin, who wrote a book called Atlantic Slave Trade. And what he has done, he has shown the areas where the slaves came from, their origin point, and then where they ended up. And then the thickness of these lines indicate the relative numbers that were transported. And down here in the corner, there's a summary. So, for example, take a look at this. Brazil. See Brazil? I don't know if you can read that. It's over 3.5 million. 3,647,000 slaves were transported from Africa to Brazil. And then the West Indies. You see the West Indies? Where are they? Yeah. Third one down. Again, hard to see, but that's over 4 million. So between the West Indies and Brazil, that's over 7.5 million African slaves transported from Africa. So that's up here. So here and here. Now, of course, lesser numbers to Guyana, the Guyanas, and to other areas of the Caribbean, and to Mexico and Central America. Mexico and Central America, 224,000. North America, 427,000. So those are the comparative numbers. Yes.
Is this including like the ones who died on en route to this place?
You'd have to go look at his book. My guess is this is the ones that actually survived. So my guess is there were more people put on the ships, but these are the actual ones that arrived. But you could check that. Philip Curtin, Atlantic Slave Trade, would be a good source if you're interested in this topic, because he's done a lot of work on a lot of research and actually put these numbers together and where people end up. Okay? So most of them, you can see, all come from the west coast here. Although you start to see towards the end, when the slave trade gets shut down here, slaves are coming from Madagascar and Mozambique, which is the southern part of South Africa. But where the Muslims were obtaining slaves was up in this part of Africa. It would be Ethiopia, Kenya, those kinds of places up there. All right, let's move on. By 1880, slavery is outlawed. Slave trade is outlawed, and to large measure, slavery itself is becoming outlawed, not just slave trade. So those are two different things to keep in mind. Slave trade, which involves primarily shipping people in ships, but slavery, slave markets, domestic slave markets are also pretty much all shut down by 1880. So, all of this, and as we see in the 19th century, slave trade is declining all the way around. So rather than the Europeans just leaving Africa alone, because there is no slave market anymore, no, it begins to attract Europeans to what we might call, quote unquote, legitimate trade, other kinds of trade, agriculture and other mineral resources. For example, peanuts, timber, animal hides, palm oil, etc. By the way, peanuts are a New World product, but they begin to be grown in Africa. Just like cocoa beans, cacao beans that make chocolate. That comes from the New World, but it begins to be grown in Africa. Okay, and coffee. Coffee actually comes from Arabia and East Africa. It begins to be grown in other parts of Africa and in South America. So today, like in Costa Rica and Colombia and stuff, they grow a lot of coffee there. That's not originally where it was from. Well, what happens is, in Britain, there's a big push to outlaw slavery. And there was actually then a push by many of these people who were trying to outlaw slavery to actually outlaw, not only outlaw the slavery, but to obtain new colonies. I told you they'd be interested in obtaining new colonies. But in obtaining a new colony, they're obtaining it because they want to prevent slaves from being traded in those colonies. Interesting motivation, right? We want a new colony. Why? To stop slave trade. Because if the British colonized it, if they took it over, then by British law, slavery was outlawed. So that's what starts to happen. People actually begin to raise money in England to purchase colonies on the west coast of Africa to thereby stop slave trade. For example, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast was another region that was purchased. You can see Sierra Leone on the map right up here. And then I highlight this country. It's called Liberia. I don't know if you've heard of Liberia. And here's the flag of Liberia up in the corner. Looks a lot like the U.S. flag. Why? Because Liberia was actually a territory which the U.S. obtained, purchased, or whatever, turned into a colony and then made it independent. The idea here is that slaves would be returned to Africa. And they returned, and so this country was kind of formed for that reason. It's called Liberia because of liberty. The capital of it is Monrovia because of President Monroe. Okay? Interesting, right? I don't know if you knew about that, but that is there, and Liberia is still there today. But Liberia's had a lot of problems in recent past, a lot of upheaval, a lot of political corruption. Well, anyway, but I mention it here because, in fact, the motivation was to end slavery, and in the case of the United States, well, you know what? We'll actually send slaves back. They'll be free. We'll free them and send them back home. Now, of course, they weren't always sent back to the exact place where they were from, but sent to Liberia. Because sometimes it's hard to know where exactly they were from, I guess. But anyway, it is an interesting chapter, in this whole history. Well, what happens then, the Europeans begin to move inland in Africa. They don't leave Africa alone, but they say, you know what, there's a lot of other stuff in Africa perhaps that would be of value to us. And so they began to move inland. The economic importance of Africa begins to be realized. They realize that in South Africa there are diamond mines, huge diamonds in some cases. In West Africa, they find that, hey, they can grow coffee like from East Africa. The Belgians take over Congo. Why? Because the Congo has copper mines. Also, the Congo can then grow chocolate, cacao. Have you ever heard of Belgium chocolate or Swiss chocolate? You can't grow that stuff in Europe. It's being grown in Africa and then processed into the chocolate in Europe. Now, these colonies, as we've seen, are providing a raw material of what these people need, and then also providing markets for finished goods. Markets for finished goods. By the way, these are coffee. This is coffee being grown here. And diamonds there. All right, let's move on. I got a few more screens to go today. Let's see if we can get them done, huh? I know I'm moving quickly, but you can always go back and review. I promise you, I will process this and get it up on YouTube today. At least that's my intention. And I'll link it to your class. So if you've not watched the other ones, you can go back and check each week. I now have, I think, all of the lectures up, except for this one, which I'll try to put up later today. Well, another reason besides economic and raw materials and markets is a military reason. You get a new colony. Why? To protect an old colony. The British obtained Egypt primarily to protect India. What? Yes. The route to India, unless you go all the way around Africa, comes through Egypt. If you bring your ships to Egypt, you can put your goods there into the Red Sea. You can take things to the Red Sea and take them through Egypt. So, in fact, Egypt is a kind of gateway to India, and certainly between Europe and India. And so the British decide we should control Egypt because that's critical to us. So they do. Well, how did that happen? Well, in fact, the Ottoman Empire controlled Egypt. The British got involved sort of helping out the Pasha of Egypt. But what happens is the French decide to take over Egypt. Why? To control the route to India and to give the British trouble. So Napoleon sends his troops to Egypt. They fight against the Mamluks and defeat them because they have superior weaponry, and they take control of Egypt for a period of time. Now, it turns out to be a rather short period of time because the British were not going to just sit around and let this happen. So the British send their ships in, and they are able to push out. Egypt was attacked by Napoleon in 1799. The Mamluks are weak, and finally the English come with their battleships. The French are pushed out of there within a couple of years, a year or two, right? And then the British take even more control, interest, influence in Egypt, and they're going to stay there for a long time. I mean, up till World War II, up till the middle of the 20th century. They're there for 150 years or so. So here is a look at Africa then in 1914. Remember I said in roughly 1800, there was no territory controlled by Europeans in Africa. Just a few little coastal harbors and things, a few little islands. Over the interceding 100 years, from roughly 1800 to 1900, the Europeans have taken over almost all of the territory of Africa, except Ethiopia. Well, there's two small areas over here on the Horn. Those are independent. Everything else is controlled in large measure by the French. All this sort of bluish purple part is the French. All the green stuff is the British. Look at all that green stuff in the British. Remember I said he wanted to control from coast to coast? There was one little area here he did not control. The Portuguese and the Germans control areas too. The German Congo and so forth. And the Italians even get in on it with they have Libya, for example, especially up here. That's an Italian-controlled area. So the Italians, the Germans, the British, the French, the Belgians, right? The Portuguese, the Spanish. And Africa, except for a couple of small areas, is controlled, colonized by the Europeans. Let's take a look at the British in Africa. Here is our ruler of Egypt, the Ottoman Pasha. His name is Muhammad Ali. You may have heard of him. Muhammad Ali. Well, this Muhammad Ali was actually from Albania, believe it or not, but he had come to gain a great deal of power as the governor of Egypt, and he was pretty smart, pretty strategic in his plan, and he sort of makes a deal with the British to sort of keep himself in power and increase his influence. One of the things that's going to happen at this time in the 19th century that we ought to mention is the construction of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, remember I told you Egypt, you just go overland a short distance, you go from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. This route cuts off going all the way around Africa, which of course is a very long trip. So the idea came to build a canal that would connect the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. And then you could have goods by ship going straight through that area. Well, this would be a shortcut to India. And of course the British were very interested in this. The canal is actually begun by the French. The French make a deal with the Egyptians. This guy, Pasha, the Muhammad Ali, he says, look, we will come in, we have the equipment, we have the engineers, we will dig it out and engineer it. All right? Well, he likes that idea. But also they said, yeah, but then you provide the manual labor. You provide the workers. He agreed to that. I don't know if he realized how many workers he was talking about. So it got to be very expensive for the Egyptians to provide thousands and thousands of workers to manually dig things and to work on all the equipment and stuff, while the French had a much smaller crew that did the engineering and ran the big equipment. But eventually they dig a route. They need no locks. You go in, you go through some lakes. I'll show you a picture, I think, in a moment. And then you come out at the Mediterranean. You can go through. I've crossed the Suez Canal on top, and they now have a tunnel under it. You can drive under it now. Yeah, that's a little scary because everybody races through there. I was in a bus with a group of students, and this bus driver was kind of crazy, because there was a long line waiting to get through it, and he just went out in the other lane, and he just passed. I don't know, 50 buses and cars, and we were actually down in a tunnel passing people on the right when there was only 2 lanes. But we made it. That's all that counts. So what happens is, by the time the canal opens in 1869, the Egyptians have spent so much money, not only on the labor, but they have spent money on just grandiose stuff. They built like an opera house. They commissioned an opera. Verdi's Aida. I don't know if you've ever heard of that opera. That thing was commissioned by the Egyptians to be performed at the opening of the canal. Well, the other thing that happens is, of course, when a lot of this gets started, the United States is in a civil war, and the cotton is really not being delivered from the United States. And the cotton of Egypt, the price went way up. And so they figure, hey, we're on easy street now. We're going to make a lot of money on the cotton. By the time the canal is finished in 1869, and a lot of the bills are coming due, the price of cotton has plummeted because the United States has ended the Civil War, and the cotton is beginning to flow out of the United States again. Well, when the Egyptians cannot pay their end of it, the British come in and purchase the Egyptian interest in it and pay off all the Egyptian bills in 1875, and kind of co-owning it with the Egyptians. And in 1881, when the British experience a rebellion by the Egyptians, the British take control of the canal completely. Them and the French, right, have control of this canal, and the Egyptians don't have any part of it at all. Now, I got a very large ladder, very tall ladder, and I went up to take a picture of the Suez Canal, as you can see it here. There's the Mediterranean, there's the Red Sea, there's Egypt, there's the Sinai Peninsula, and you can see the canal going through. It goes through some lakes and makes its way all the way there. So there's the Suez Canal. All right? So a very important stretch that's there, extremely important for trade and for Egypt. All right. I got about 4 or 5 more screens. No, not too many. 3 or 4 more screens. So let's do that and we'll be done for today. The Ottoman Empire is collapsing as well. And when that happens, the British and the French are going to move into the Ottoman Empire areas, but also in Africa. So that's in North Africa. When the Ottoman Empire collapses, the British and the French move in to take over all the Ottoman territory in North Africa, like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and so forth. And the French get most of that. The British and the French move in. The British are moved further south. They take over Egypt, the Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya. And so then the French, of course, take Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. So remember I told you there's the expansion of Europe, but there's also the disassembly, the falling apart of the Ottomans and the Chinese. And so that's really going to mean great differences that are there. All right, we've got about 4 minutes and 3 screens, so we can do that. I'm just going to put all the text up here and talk a little bit about East Africa slave trade. East Africa had also been a place where slave trade had happened. Mostly these were all Muslim slave traders who are transporting slaves into the Islamic world, but also selling slaves to the Europeans. Why did they want these slaves? Should sound familiar to us. Sugar. Sugar plantations, sugar will grow. It has enough water. It's got enough warmth. Well, places like the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River Valley, there were sugarcane plantations there. And, of course, since it's hard work, slaves were used to take care of a lot of that work. Also, we start to see that things like cloves are being transported and grown and so forth from the Malaccas. And as I told you to the end, towards the end of the slave market, even for the Europeans, since West Africa had pretty much been controlled, came over to the control of mostly the British and others who wanted to end slavery, the slave market will eventually move to Zanzibar, and areas of the southern and eastern part of Africa. So Arab merchants are searching for slaves because it's getting harder for them to obtain those slaves. I guess I point this out because I have had people in the past tell me that Christianity was a slave religion and Islam was not. That's simply not true. There are plenty of slaves being bought and sold by Muslims. The rule that the Muslims had, of course, is you couldn't buy or sell another Muslim. But they didn't bother to tell that to the people that they were enslaving, to say, hey, I want to convert to Islam, so you can't make me a slave, something like that. But anyway, Charles Gordon, the guy in the upper right corner, came to Uganda to end slave trade there and made it a British colony in the process. All right, 2 more screens, and then we are finished. And that's good because we got 2 minutes. I want to mention David Livingstone, probably one of the most well-known, perhaps most, he certainly publicized Africa to the British and to many people in North America and Europe. He was from Scotland. He was a medical doctor. He went to Africa in 1841, the central part of Africa, to preach. He's the first Westerner to report of the Victorian Falls, these huge falls that are there, waterfalls. He became a celebrity in Europe because he wrote letters, he wrote journal things, and he sent them back to Europe where they were published in a serial form. So that means, like every week you might get an update. Oh, let's see what David Livingstone's been up to. And of course his stories were exotic. He's telling about this land where nobody had been, seeing animals that no one else in Europe had ever seen. He's having all kinds of adventures. So he's often considered an explorer, but he went there as a missionary, we would call him today a medical missionary, to evangelize, also to be a medical doctor. And he uses his celebrity to speak out against slavery. So he was one of the forces that helped promote the end of slavery through the British. 1 more screen, and then we'll go. Zanzibar in 1873. This is the last slave market closes in 1873 with pressure from London and South America. You see we have European settlers that are there, especially these Afrikaners. You see these guys on the left here with their guns and so forth. They kind of look like Wild West, and that's really sort of what it was, sort of like the Wild West. These guys were there, but they are pushing out the native people, the people from Africa, pushing them further north, and this is what causes a lot of the tension that we mentioned before, that the Afrikaners, as they move eastward, begin to fight the different tribes there, and then the Zulu begin to attack. And so this is another part of the settlement of Africa, in this case, with immigrants, mostly from Dutch background. We are out of time. Have a good weekend. Your test is due Sunday night. We don't have class on Tuesday. We will see you